Good morning. I'm Sarah Gardy, and on behalf of the Mount Vernon Historic Preservation Commission, I'd like to welcome you to this seminar on painting your historic home. Our speaker today is Marlis A. Svensson. Marlis is president of Svensson Tyler Incorporated, a historic preservation consulting firm located in Wisconsin. She founded this firm in Davenport in 1988 after working for 12 years in state and municipal governments in the area of historic preservation and community development. Marlis is a graduate of Luther College and a native Iowan. Those are two pluses for her. She worked for the state of Iowa in the beginning of her career in historic preservation. Then she moved to the city of Davenport and worked there for a number of years, both with government, nonprofits, and private developers. She has written and published 3 books on Davenport history and architecture. In the 1990s, she did a lot of work for the city of Iowa City. This involved preparation of the Comprehensive Historic Preservation Plan for Iowa City in 1993, and then she worked on the Brown Street National Register nomination. She has also done neighborhood surveys in the North Side, Goosetown, and most recently, downtown Iowa City. Marlis has been very active in a range of community and statewide organizations, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Iowa Historic Preservation Alliance. Please help me welcome Marlis Svensson.
Good morning. Thank you for that fine and nice introduction. I sometimes put the words on paper and never read them for months at a time, so nice to be reminded occasionally who I am. And it's also very nice to be back here in Mount Vernon. This, I believe, is the 3rd time I've done a historic paint scheme workshop in Mount Vernon. I've also done a workshop a few years ago on how to research your historic house. And it's nice to come back and see there's a lot of new paint in town. I don't take credit for that at all, but I do take credit for at least inspiring a few people to think beyond the white envelope that has enveloped so many of our historic buildings through the years. What we're going to do this morning is a couple of things, really 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to review architectural styles as they appear throughout Iowa and the Midwest. Some of these are more or less reflected in building stock here in Mount Vernon. You may see your building amongst them. If you don't see buildings that are like those, if some of these buildings are not like what you find in Mount Vernon, perhaps on another weekend trip through the state, you'll see buildings that are very similar. So that will be the first part of the presentation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some typical rules in painting historic houses. And I do call them rules because they are helpful for us to know what to do and not do and what will take us in the right direction in accomplishing the end result. And that's an appropriate period paint scheme. We can call it a historic scheme, but I like to call it a period paint scheme because we may not know exactly how our historic house was actually painted, but we know how other houses during the period were painted. And that's the rules that get applied in a discussion we're going to have today. The third part, I will take you on another slide tour and we'll look at some of those rules and actions. And we'll group buildings according to period and the rules of colors applied in terms of historic period. So that will be a lesson for us all. And then I have a group of slides that was kindly taken for us recently, just hot off the press by Dean Thomas, and he will be able to, or Dick Thomas I should say, I always think of him as Dean, but Dick Thomas. And these are slides of current Mount Vernon houses. And I'll make a few comments about what was done right, what maybe could have been done a little bit better, and in some cases what really is an error in how the paint colors got applied. And none of this is meant in critical fashion, other than to say we can always do better. A paint job needs to be done every 7 to 10 years, so there's always a chance for an improvement. So the comments will be offered in that spirit. So why don't we begin with taking a look at architectural styles. first architectural style we find in Iowa coming in the 1840s is the Greek Revival. And very typically the Greek Revival has very symmetrical appearance, often a gable ends on the roof either facing the street or in this case on a side gable. This house was built in the 1840s and it's very balanced. The windows are often flat as you see here, and occasionally you'll find important Greek Revival elements like the entrance portico on this particular building. Massive columns, again very rectilinear windows, straight window arches or window lintels as you see here. This building was built of stone with cut stone window lintels, and a couple years back had been covered in stucco until the owners removed it and recovered the stone that you see here. Sometimes the Greek Revival was attached to even smaller buildings such as this little shotgun cottage. You've probably heard the term shotgun cottage before and never known what it meant. Well, if you stand at the front door of a shotgun cottage and you aim your shotgun through that door and fire it, you'll never hit a wall because all the door openings line up on the interior of the building, and so that's where the name shotgun cottage came from. In this case, the Greek Revival elements include that flat transom above the door and again the multi-light windows rectilinear in shape. There were other houses that were built that were a little less elegant, and they became known as I houses. An I house is a side gable, two-story building, generally symmetrical but less refined. They were called I houses because they were popularly found in the states of Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, hence the name I house. And this particular example is found in Iowa City, and it has a center gable along the front. Again, they typically had a front porch that extended across the main entrance, sometimes all the way across the front. I houses are found throughout the farmsteads of the Midwest and are very, very enjoyable buildings. The next style that came along, roughly in the period of the Civil War, was a style we know as the French Second Empire. And the French Second Empire is most distinguished by one of its main features, and that's the mansard roof. Other elements of the building are very classical in design. In the case of this particular building, it also has the fretwork along the roof edges. Sometimes mansard roofed French Second Empire style houses were more modest, as this rooming house was when it was constructed, but it still has that mansard roof, the distinguishing feature of a French Second Empire design. These houses were built all the way up until the 1880s in Iowa. Terrace Hill in Des Moines is probably the best known example of a French Second Empire in the state. The Gothic Revival was another style employed at the same time, right around the Civil War, 1850s to the 1870s. The Gothic Revival is most known by its very steeply pitched peaks on its gable roofs, and sometimes the pointed arches you find on windows, as you see here. The buildings in this period, as I said before, from the Civil War all the way up to the 1880s, are called late Victorian, and they typically were painted with dark, rich colors. So that's very often what we find in some of our older neighborhoods in eastern cities in Iowa. Another style in the same time period, the late Victorian, is the Italianate. And there are a couple of different forms of the Italianate style, but they all have one thing in common. They have brackets, large brackets along their eaves, and they're shown here on this example, which is what we call a Tuscan Italianate. The Tuscan Italianate frequently had a cupola or belvedere at the center of the hipped roof, but otherwise was very symmetrical. The other form, the Villa Italianate, had a tower that reflected what was called the campanile, or in Italian, a freestanding bell tower. But that was incorporated into the Italianate style in England before the style was sent back to the United States for what we know of as the Villa Italianate style. Frequently, again, these houses have heavy brackets along the eaves and a low-pitched, hipped roof. Some Italianate style houses don't have a belvedere. but they still have those heavy brackets as you see on this one. And as time passed in the century, they began to wrap porches around these houses as well, with decorative ornamentation, belvederes, scroll-cut trim, all very elegant. The next style to come along in Iowa is a beginning of what we call the classical revivals. And these houses began in the very late 1880s, more likely in the 1890s, and continued all the way up until, in some parts of the state, until the First World War. The Queen Anne is the most prominent of these early styles, and it is known also primarily by its asymmetrical shape and the presence of a turret or tower. Frequently, Queen Anne style houses had porches that wrapped around them in every direction, in some cases, and in most instances they had a basic hipped roof with projecting gable roof sections in multiple directions. Other examples, as the period goes on, tend to lean towards the classical ornamentation. The treatment that you see in the gable end of this particular house is what we call a Palladian window. That is a flat arched window to either side of a semicircular arched window. But again, here's that turret, that all-important tower and turret. They were richly ornamental, and the idea was to make them a feast for the eye. As the period went on, we began to see the buildings begin to get a little more simple. Sometimes the ornamentation became strictly classical. Apologize, that slide isn't going to show for us, but they became richly ornamental in a very simple fashion. By the end of the period, we began to move from Queen Anne into what we call classical revival or colonial revival styles. And frequently these houses, the ornament goes back to the Renaissance period, and we have what are called entrance porticos instead of porches. They almost always have columns instead of turned posts or spindles. Here's that Palladian window again above the entrance portico with the flat arched windows to either side of a semicircular arched window. And then in the gable peak there, you begin to see another feature, that fan light with the multi-light radiation, giving you an idea of what the architect had in mind. Instead of brackets, as you might have found in an Italianate-style house 30 years earlier, we find what are called modillions, and they are a much shallower bracket, if you will, and they are generally found singularly rather than in pairs, or they are uniformly spaced along the cornice or eave of the house. In this particular case, the house has all those rich details I was talking about, and then some. We call the spacing of these square projections along the cornice dentils, and in this particular case, that's what they look like. They look like a row of teeth along the edge of the house. And again, that Palladian window up close. Flat arches to either side and a round arch in the middle. Classical revival houses took generally larger scale than most of the Queen Anne houses of the earlier period. Large, spacious interior plans, big porticos and porches wrapping their edges. And this one, as you see, gives you an idea of what you frequently found in a classical revival as opposed to a Queen Anne, and that is absolute symmetry and balance. If there's a window on the right, there's a window on the left. If there's a column on the right, there's a column on the left. And that's what you find in this particular house in Davenport. The next style that grew out of this time period, about the time of the First World War, was the Georgian Revival. And it is most distinguished by the fact that the houses have side gable roofs with dormers across the attic level. Frequently, the gable ends, as you see here, had what we call cornice returns. The cornice line comes down along the eaves and then turns back on itself, and that's what's called a returning cornice. The porticos disappear in general from Georgian revivals, and the house finish becomes a little flatter. The next style to come out of this same classical revival period is what we call the Dutch colonial. And the distinguishing feature of this style is the gambrel roof. Not a gable roof, but a gambrel, what we typically think of in Iowa as a farmstead's barn roof. But they were built on houses at the same time that they were being put on barns across Iowa. And frequently they would have a shed dormer, as you see here, to carry the windows to the second floor. Gambrel cottages, as we sometimes call them also, were sometimes turned towards the street, and they were very adaptable for very small houses, as you see in this particular gambrel cottage. Gambrel roof lines were also used on dormers, as the side dormers in this house show. Very simple, but the roof line is the distinguishing characteristic. Some of the houses were a little more elaborate, as this one on Melrose Circle in Iowa City was, and it also took its gambrel roof one step beyond. It gave it a clipped gambrel roof. And if you look at the right side in this particular view, you see that the gambrel pitch at the very top is laid back or clipped. And that was a style typical also of the colonial revival, Dutch-inspired colonial revival houses in this time period. Other classical revivals are more mixed. And this particular house in Cedar Rapids takes the vocabulary of the classical revival and it applies it to a form that we have come to know as the suburban cottage, because they were literally built all over the United States in streetcar suburbs. And in the case of Cedar Rapids, some of these houses were built along streetcar lines, along 3rd Avenue, 2nd Avenue, very important districts in those communities, literally littered with these houses, big houses with lots of classical vocabulary in the building elements. The next style that came along, another revival, not a classical revival, but a period revival, was a style that came to be known as the Tudor revival. Frequently the houses were built with two media, usually brick and stucco. Brick on the bottom, stucco on the upper level. Added to that was a set of wood members that were called half timbering, and that was usually put on the upper level or in the gable peak, as you see here. And the idea was to harken back to England, the old country homes of the Tudor period, and give you that feeling, that reflection in the buildings that were being constructed in this time period. But not all Tudor revival houses were as large and commodious as these examples. Some were quite small. This little Tudor cottage is built on Melrose Court in Iowa City, and it too has the main elements. It is a stucco finish. The amount of half timbering is quite modest, just in the gable peak and over the entrance door. But those varied roof lines, an asymmetrical appearance, that's all telling you I'm a Tudor revival house. From the Tudor revival came a whole series of houses, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But I wanted to acquaint you now with probably the most common house form in Mount Vernon in this time period, and that's the American four square. This was a house form that basically had a square footprint and a square wall. It had a hipped roof. And here are three different examples of that form, of varying pitches. Frequently there would be dormers, in this case hipped dormers on the gables, or on the dormers in the attic area. Porches would frequently extend across the front of the buildings. And these houses came to be well-loved houses in America. They started to open up floor plans a little bit on the interior, but we all came to know these as American four square. I grew up in an American four square. I didn't know it was that at the time, but as I reflect back on it now, I recognize all the elements of the American four square in the interior space that I grew up in. This one has a little bit of a bell cast in its roof edge. That means it comes down at a low pitch and then curves a little bit. That's very typical of American four square houses. The other houses that grew out of this period were more distinctly what we call craftsman style. They came out of the arts and crafts movement in furniture that gave us mission style furniture. The same movement gave us craftsman style in our architecture. The Craftsman style could be delivered in an American square form, or it could be in a front gable, as we see here, or it could be in a side gable, and I'll show you examples of all of those. It was very rectilinear. If you had ornamentation, it was generally confined to knee brace brackets, as you see along the gable end, or exposed rafter tails along the porch and the sides. The windows were generally square-topped, and they frequently had divided lights in the upper half of the sash. In that case, they were generally vertically divided. So again, you had a building that gave you a very rectilinear shape. Most of these examples are from Cedar Rapids because the neighborhoods there are just filled with them. All the Wellington Heights neighborhoods in Cedar Rapids are filled with these houses. And again, they typically have sloping, either gable or shed-roofed dormers on the attic level, or they might have an entrance portico, such as you see here. This little entrance stoop actually is, I think, just supported by knee brace brackets. Very interesting. I generally find that the Craftsman style houses are more horizontal in general appearance, and it's because of the grouping of windows that this generally happens. But here again are those multi-light windows I was telling you about with the vertical upper sash. Another example, also in Cedar Rapids, this one has wall dormers on the front, gable-roofed wall dormers. They extend right through the roof line in face with the front wall, hence we call them wall dormers. And this is a good example of a Craftsman-style American four-square. And it has a couple of different siding elements. This was typically done in the Craftsman style so that the lower level would be one material, let's say wide siding, and the upper level might be shingles, or in this case, double courses of shingles that are actually two different widths. It made for a very handsome treatment. From the Craftsman style here in the Midwest, we move into what is known as the Prairie School style. I only have a couple of slides of houses that tend to have a Prairie School feel to them. And you might say, well, what distinguishes this building? Well, it is not only the exterior, but the interior that does that. But in this case, the building has generally more of a horizontal feel. The windows are banded together, wrapping around the sleeping porch here at the end. And the feel of the horizontal comes from the siding as well. This one has a staggered shingle siding that ties it together in that respect. This building is stucco in finish, but the windows also are banded together and a very low pitch on the hipped roof. In this case, there's also a belt course around a portion of the house on the left side that gives it a very horizontal feel. The bungalow came out of Craftsman style during this period, and this is a common house form throughout eastern Iowa. Again, with the exposed knee brace brackets along the roof line. A bungalow typically was the preferred house form from the right before the First World War through the 1920s in a lot of neighborhoods. Very often it was with a side gable roof, as you see here, and with shed dormers extending out over the porch. Sometimes bungalows were very small, and we find in very modest neighborhoods you can find a whole block after block filled with front gable bungalows. Bungalow became a house name that realtors love to use, so they called many different house forms bungalows in this time period. This is one of my favorite bungalows in the Redmond Park Historic District in Cedar Rapids, a very well-painted bungalow. And again, the contiguous gables, in this case, the gable front porch is set right beneath the gable of the main house. The next and last group of houses we're going to move into are the English period revivals. These grew out of the 1930s period all the way, and were built all the way up through the post-war housing boom in America. They were houses that, again, drew from the English garden cottages that were being built at the time. The earliest ones, the most spirited designs looked the most like they came from England, but over time it came to be a distinctly American look to them. The most compelling period element in all of these buildings is that vertical look to the entrance portico, a projecting section, I shouldn't say portico, but the entrance projection. Frequently, to give you a sense of the Tudor period coming from England, inset in that was frequently a round arched entrance or a round arched window, as you see here. Most of these houses had contiguous gables. That's one gable touching the edge of another gable. Frequently, one side of that gable would be extended further to the right, as you see on this little cottage, or in this one. This is, if any of you are from Iowa City, you will know this as the Irving Weber House in Iowa City in the Melrose Court neighborhood. The interesting thing about the period revival is by the time these houses were being built in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, this one was built in 1929, by the way, every house needed a garage. So by and large, you find garages that start to match the houses. They're either attached or they actually match it in design, and that's what you find in this case. But this one has the contiguous gables, a side gable roof on the main house with a small projecting L towards the front with a contiguous gable on the roof line. That extended gable you see here, in this particular example, you also see the other prominent feature in these houses, and that usually was a 2 to 2.5 story tall chimney. And that was a frequent feature of the design of these buildings. And again, a very asymmetrical appearance in the front. In the 1930s, during the Depression, the Federal Housing Act was passed and the establishment of the FHA loan began. And with it came great inspiration from Washington going national. And that was for the way houses should look. The FHA hired platoons of architects to come up with the best, the cheapest, the smallest house they could come up with for Americans to build with their new FHA loan. And they came up with a basic 4-room plan with, in some cases, a second floor that could be finished off as sort of a sleeping dormitory for the children. But the concept here was a 600 square foot house that could be lived in, occupied, and really be adequate for single family occupancy. Some of those houses began to take on the ornamentation of the Cape Cod cottages of New England. And the Cape Cod then became the most prominent house design sponsored by the FHA during the 1930s and 40s. Hence, when we started building houses again at the end of the Depression and into the post-war boom, this is what we built in our new suburbs. Frequently, the Cape Cod had a more symmetrical appearance with the dormers on the second floor in case you decided to finish off that attic level later on. The FHA loan wasn't going to help you do that, but if you had the opportunity later on, you'd have windows. Frequently, garages were attached to these houses as well, or not. It just depended how the lot was configured. They were very well laid out for very narrow lots in automobile suburbs. So this is the last slide I have for you today. It's a good example of a Cape Cod style cottage with an attached garage. It's trying to look very sophisticated, and today we think of it as a historic style. At the time it was very modern. So that's a little look at architectural styles and how they laid themselves out through the middle of the 19th century here in Iowa, all the way up through the middle of the 20th century. I'm going to turn off my slides now for a little bit and talk a little bit about basic color selection principles. I like to tell people that when they begin to think about putting colors on their house, they need to think about where their house is. And that's the first thing to think about. Is there dense foliage around your house? And if there is, generally start thinking about lighter colors. This isn't rocket science for the most part, but it's worth thinking about in a very deliberate fashion. Is it an exposed site? Have the trees been removed? Are you going to remove trees? I always encourage people to think about keeping trees and major shrubbery at least 10 feet away from their house. Foundation shrubs are different, but major trees, keep them at least 10 feet away. And that means the drip line. That doesn't mean the tree. That means the drip line. So if you've got a tree touching your house now, think about removing it. I'm a tree hugger, but I do believe that trees have their place, and in an urban setting, in a yard, in a developed housing setting, they need to be a little further from your house. And over time, you too will be happier. It'll make your life easier if you're doing the paint job, or make your contractor's life easier. So if you do have a more exposed site, that's when you can begin to think about slightly darker colors. So rule number 1, dense foliage, light colors, exposed site, medium to darker colors. The next thing you need to do is examine the colors that are in existence on nearby homes for compatibility. And that means that if you want to paint your house green, and the house next door is green, and the house to the other side is green, you might want to think about something different. And that just means they got there first. I always tell people houses need to be repainted every 7 to 10 years, so you might get another chance to have a green house. But be respectful of being compatible with the houses that are in your neighborhood. Next rule, if your house, the front of the house, faces north, generally you're going to want to have lighter colors. And I've just found this to be a rule over the years in the application of colors myself. When I've tried to put darker colors on north-facing houses, they just don't work, because the north face is always in shadow to begin with. And if you add dark colors, you simply accentuate those shadows to the point where you can't see the detail. So if the primary facade of the house faces north, think about slightly lighter colors. And then always keep in mind your principal landscape features. If you have a lot of color in your landscape, such as red bushes or yellow shrubs, yellowish shrubs, you might want to keep those colors in mind when you balance them off. I have found that, for example, if you have red barberry as a prominent color in your trim, it looks absolutely glorious with a house painted in greens and grays. It doesn't look so good if the house is painted in terracotta colors. They fight. You want to make sure that the colors are compatible in that respect. The second group of rules relates to the size of the house, and these aren't rocket science either. Generally, larger houses take darker colors, smaller houses take lighter colors. If you paint a small house, a set of dark colors, it will look even smaller. That's just an optical reality, so keep that in mind. Sometimes people want their house to look smaller. Maybe a very large, sprawling Queen Anne sitting on a hill. It's up in the top of the hill. They want it to look smaller. They painted a darker color. So that's how you use that particular rule to help you accomplish a goal. Then there are rules that apply to certain building parts. I believe that you need to use color to emphasize the natural play of light and shadow that's already going on in your building. In other words, if you have an eave, and under that eave are brackets that are set back, and they have a design cut out of them, it's in shadow, you want to accentuate that shadow by painting it a darker color, rather than fight it by painting it a lighter color. So use color to accentuate shadow. So for elements that are in shadow, you may want to do that. You also want to maintain the sense of proportion in how you paint your building parts. That is, do not overemphasize small details with separate colors. It never was done historically. It doesn't make sense to now. It simply makes you look crazy when you're done. People think, how could they stand up there with a paintbrush picking out that tiny little detail with an accent color? They must have been nuts. And you know what? You were. So don't do it. Resist, under all circumstances, picking out small details with separate colors. It was never done historically, and you'll drive yourself nuts if you try to do it. And if you hire the work done, your painting contractor will charge you duly for it. I believe that there are projecting features on a building that frequently deserve a special contrasting color. And we'll look at some of those examples in slides in a minute. People frequently ask me in terms of building parts what kind of paint to apply. Well, I have mixed feelings, and they change every year as new paints come out in terms of best kinds of paint. But generally, a less glossy finish is what you want to put on your body. If there are any irregularities from the scraping that you've done, and you don't need to get all the paint off. In fact, I caution against removing all paint. There's no reason to do it. It's not a healthy thing to do for you, the painter or your contractor. Leave as much secure paint on the building as you can and simply apply the new paint over it. But you're going to have a slightly roughened texture. The best way to diminish that appearance is to put on a paint that has a flat finish. The trim is something else. Trim takes the biggest beating on a paint. It sheds water over all the surface very directly, and I generally suggest a semi-gloss for the trim and a gloss or semi-gloss for the window sash and doors. It tends to brighten those elements and set off that final little detail that deserves to be set off in the house. Another rule, avoid too much contrast or not enough contrast when you're picking out your colors. Frequently, people will select a color for the body of their house and then simply select a slightly different shade of the same hue. And what you want to do if you do that is make sure there's enough difference on that color between those color chips that you can really see the difference, because otherwise it will not have made enough difference to make for anybody to care. So keep that in mind. That's something to have enough difference in the two different colors that you're choosing. But sometimes you don't want to have too much difference. And we'll have some examples of that here. And that is where you have a very dark color on your house, and then you put white or very light cream on the trim. That's too much contrast, and it jars the eye visually. One of the things I think that painting allows you to do with a historic building is to camouflage non-original building parts. So try to do that with your paint scheme. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean. Downspouts and gutters should match the building part to which they are applied. So that's a rule. If you have a gutter, it should match the soffit and fascia. If you have a downspout, it should generally match if it's a corner board piece of trim, it should match that color. I've frequently seen people in a newer ranch-style house in a suburban setting paint the downspouts a trim color. It's because they don't have any other trim on the house. They want to paint something, so they paint their downspouts a contrasting color. Resist that temptation. Paint it the color of the element to which it is applied, and it really makes all the difference. You want to hide that element. You don't want to draw attention to it. The other thing is don't overthink your color choice. For example, if you have a building that has had a fire escape attached to it, let's say it's a rental apartment building now, originally a 2 or 3 family house, or a 2 or 3 family house now, but a single family house originally. That black fire escape got attached to the building at some point. Well, if you use the rule I just gave you, you paint that fire escape out. And I've done that. I've tried it. It doesn't work. People expect to see a fire escape be black, and that's the color it should be. It's sort of like a television antenna. If you were to paint a television antenna to match the roof so that it would disappear, you know what? You'd notice it all the more. And the same thing with the fire escape. Our eye tells us from years and years of seeing fire escapes everywhere in our environment that that's a fire escape, it's black, it's there, I see it, but you sort of ignore it. If you paint it, let's say the house is yellow and you paint the fire escape yellow, suddenly that fire escape is more visible instead of less visible. So use camouflaging, but don't overuse it. Another question I often get is, what do you do with shutters? If the house did not originally have shutters, take them off. The house has lots of ornamentation if it's an old house, and by the time we get done with this, with the next section here, and I'll show you some examples of painting it, you'll see you really don't need the shutters to give it a rich sense of ornamentation and detail. So if the house didn't come with shutters, more than likely you don't need it to give it its detail. So another question I often get is, well, what do I do with awnings? Awnings are a real difficult matter. If they are original, you may want to consider keeping them, obviously. But if the house originally had canvas awnings added for sun protection, there may be a reason as well. But there's something to work with in your color scheme, and be careful not to overdo the accent that you bring about with the awnings. They are generally applied, I have found, to buildings when owners have painted the rest of the building a monochromatic color scheme, but they really wanted something there, so they put up colorful awnings. And that is generally a lack of courage in their paint scheme. Put the ornamentation in the paint scheme and let the awnings be a more quiet statement than they were. Awnings were originally single colors. They were like dark green, and that was about it on a house. You might have found some other dark red, maybe an occasional stripe, but you didn't find the rich colors that we find in awning choices today. So don't make your house into a boutique shop in downtown Mount Vernon or someplace else. Let it be a residence. Avoid excesses. That's another rule. Enhance the house's best features without drawing too much attention to the effort. And we'll see that again in the slides in a moment. But the most important thing there is to remember, our houses are not San Francisco's painted ladies. Those are not historic or period paint schemes. They're boutique paint schemes. I call them today affectionate paint schemes. I see them all over, and there's a good number of examples of affectionate paint schemes here in Mount Vernon. Another question.
I've noticed around town, and I've kind of had to deal with this on a commercial building, is that sometimes over time you get a hodgepodge of windows in a building. The originals, and maybe there was an addition added on in a completely different shape of window. Now, does it ever make sense to think about that one window is so different from all the rest of them that you don't want to treat it the same as all the rest of them?
You mean you might want to hide it?
You might want to just make it disappear as much as possible, or should you always just bravely go ahead and do the same thing on every window, no matter how many different styles of windows you've got in the building?
If you have a house, I would say yes. But on a commercial building, I can see a situation where you might decide you want to basically paint out a non-conforming window. I can see doing that. And there's nothing worse than if you've got a house, let's say you've got a historic house with a modern wing, and somebody put in a series of casement windows that ring the sunroom, for example. I might decide to simply paint all those casement windows, the sash as well as the trim, the same color, and not draw attention. It's the historic windows in the house that you want to draw attention to with the contrasting sash color. So I probably, in that instance, if I had a whole new window unit, I would paint them all one color. So people often ask me, what are the steps in painting their house? Well, this is what I tell people to do. First of all, figure out where your house fits in time and architectural style. And what you should normally think of is, if your house was built in that 1820 to 1840 period, and there aren't many in Iowa that are painted in that from that time period, then you generally paint your house in colors that are shades of white, creams, sand, buff, with dark green as the trim color. That was frequently done. The early Victorian period covers that period from roughly 1840 to 1870. And then I suggest, or not just I, but others who were suggesting paint colors at the time, suggested pale earth tones. And these are for the Gothic revival, the Tuscan, and the Italianate style houses. Pale earth tones to darker earth tones. If it was built after the Civil War, which is when most housing was built in Iowa, that 1870 to 1890 period, that's when the colors get a little deeper and richer. Dark, rich colors for the Queen Anne, the Italianate, and the French Second Empire. By the turn of the century, the decade before, beginning in the 1890s, all the way up through the 1920s, we start to see the classical revivals. And that's when we see a return to lighter colors, creams, pastels, and grays, various shades. A lot of monochromatic color schemes in that time period. The period revivals were realistic colors and a minimal amount of painting. But if it was a period cottage and it was intended to look like brick, paint it brick color. Or the natural colors that we begin to see in the Craftsman and Prairie School. And again, greens, browns, golds, tans, and grays all fall into that category. Now you notice I've not said anything about blue, pink, and orange, those kinds of colors. You're not surprised, but it's just a word to the cautious. Generally, if the color was not around in use prior to 1940, don't put it on your house anywhere else either. They were colors that just weren't appropriate. The deeply rich, modern, vibrant colors that we associate with our living today were just not appropriate. So figure out when your house was built, its architectural style, and then that's where you start. The next thing is consider what your roof color is. I always tell people you have to know what your roof color is, and you can't fight it. I've tried to. The very first paint job I ever put on a house was my own house. And I didn't like the roof color, and I was just going to fight it tooth and nail. And I started painting it, and it looked so bad we had to stop and go back and live with the roof color. Completely changed the color system, and that's when I started studying paint systems, paint schemes on buildings, when I made the mistake on my own house. And so I've done that ever since, trying to learn from mistakes, see your roof color. If you're going to change your roof color, make sure that what you're painting now will be compatible with what your new roof color is. I often recommend doing a do-it-yourself paint sampling with sandpaper, going around on various building parts and just seeing what paint colors were there before. The next thing to do is to, number one, select your body color. Make sure that it fits your taste, the time frame, the style of your house, and that it's appropriate for size and location. All those other things I was telling you about light, medium, and dark colors. Make sure you do that. Then select a trim color, keeping in mind your 19th and 20th century aesthetics, what colors would have been appropriate. Then it's a matter of deciding what to paint what color. In general, the main porch elements get the trim color, whether they're horizontal or vertical. Window and doors get trim, gets that same trim color. The water table, the storyboards or the corner boards, or a belt course. Belt course separates floors. Storyboard separates first story from second story. A corner board is on the edge. They all get painted that same second trim color. The eaves and their components, the soffit and the fascia. And if you can never remember which is soffit and which is fascia, here's an easy rule. If you face it, it's the fascia. So that's the fascia board. The soffit is the underneath board. So if you throw around those terms when you're talking to the painting contractor, I want my soffit and fascia painted such and such, they'll think you know what you're talking about. And if he really wants to know if you know what you're talking about, you face the fascia. So remember that. That gets painted the same trim color. So far we've only got the body as one color, the trim for all these other elements I've talked about. Then we come to the third color. That's the window, sash, and doors. The window sash are the parts of the window that move up and down. The very inner part that holds the glass, that's the sash. And that gets painted a dark color. The dark color choices you have are generally limited. They are black, charcoal, dark brown, dark green, or dark red or maroon. And that's about it. So those are your choices for that inner sash color. You use the same color for your entrance doors. And I was talking with somebody just the other day, and we were talking about the fact that somebody had painted their front door black. And I said, well, that's right, because they wanted to do their sash black. So if you don't want your front door to be black, then you better pick a different color for your sash. And if you want a red front door, then you need to work red into your elements. So sometimes you go forward and backwards in how you put a color scheme together. But generally, the front door and the back door, any entrance doors, are the same color as your sash. If you're considering adding a third trim color, so we've got the body color, the main trim color, and the sash and door trim color, and you really want to add another color, I would just say be very cautious. Few houses can actually take that much color, and don't get carried away with it if you do. But you need to do enough of it to make sense and not look like you were not courageous. So if you do use that accent color, things you might do with it would be to pick out elements on a bracket, not the whole bracket, but elements on it, elements on a modillion. If you had a classical style house that had a course of dentils and modillions along the cornice, and you wanted to set them off a little bit from the trim, and they are in shadow, what you might want to consider is taking the basic trim color that you've painted the house trim with and simply darken that a shade or two and put that on the modillions and the brackets. And they're in shadow already, they're looking darker. Now it'll just draw your attention to them a little more. Another element of a house that people frequently ask me how to paint is one that I wish they didn't paint at all, and that's the foundation. But sometimes you're stuck with the foundation that somebody already painted. So what do? Well, my advice is to paint it the color that nature intended. That means if it's sandstone, paint it tan. If it was a limestone foundation, paint it gray. If it was cinder block, paint it gray. And if it was originally stuccoed, paint it kind of a putty color. So the combinations relate to what foundation materials were, not to what is going on any of the rest of the house, but simply in relationship to what it was originally. Porch elements. Through the years, I have experimented with techniques for painting porch colors. People used to say, who were doing paint counseling, that you should always paint the porch color a color that picked up on the balance of the colors in the house. But somewhere along the way, I think people became smarter than that, and they started painting them gray. And there's a reason. Gray is a very durable, good color. It doesn't show dirt. You paint your porch floor dark red or dark green, and the first time you've got a dust storm or a rainstorm, you've got a filthy mess. Gray does not show dirt. It really is a good color. And it's sort of like a black fire escape. You expect to see porch deck gray. So unless you really want to be a slave to housekeeping on your porch or a lot of extra painting, because dark colors tend to wear off for some reason a lot easier on a porch floor, I would advise painting them gray. You might shift from a blue gray to a more of a brownish gray, but that would be about the only shift. Other things, the skirting panels on the front of your porch. People frequently want to see them in two colors. And a skirting panel has a frame, and then it has a background material. Paint the frame your trim color, and that background material, whether it's lattice or vertical boards, the best advice I can give you is to paint that the body color of the house. And that will give you a color that fits and works and isn't too dark. Don't paint it the color of the sash. That would be too dark. So if you have red sash, don't paint it red. Paint it the body color. Like say you've got gray, light gray for your trim, dark gray for your body, then use the dark gray for your recessed area. Other colors, the ceiling, porch ceiling. Porch ceilings were painted a couple different ways. Very often at the turn of the century they were originally finished with varnish, and if your porch still has a varnished ceiling, I would leave it that way. If it has been painted, it might have been painted blue. That was a very common thing to do, to paint a sky blue on the porch. I sort of like that. That's sort of a country small town look, but I really enjoy it. Otherwise, just paint it the same trim color, or you could even paint it the body color. But don't paint it something too unusual. It's to blend into the background. That's the general idea. Shutters we've talked about already. They should be painted either the color of the window sash, or if you are including another alternate accent trim color, then the shutters can be that color. Don't paint the beveled edges on corner boards, as I was talking about earlier. And then the stacking effect, as I've talked about. This is a real important thing to look at your house and study it. And if the material changes from first to second to third floor, that's something to draw attention to with color. And sometimes it's one color on the first floor, second color on the second floor, and then you go back to the first color on the third floor. Occasionally, you'll pick yet a third color, as we did on the one building here on the campus. But in general, you want to draw attention to those divisions and the change in material. Tudor Revival style buildings is a common building to have been mispainted through the years. But I've generally found that the only color that works on half timbering is a nice deep dark chocolate brown. It just stands out best. If you try to paint the only other color that might work would be if you had a combination that had a nice dark, really dark green. But in general, brown works best. So half timbering should be thought of as its own distinct color on a building, a Tudor Revival, and it should be a nice dark brown. Most frequent painting errors, just in summary, that I've seen, and I've talked about a few of them in the slides, are picking out the downspouts in an accent color, attaching shutters where there were none in order to get more visual interest. My advice is get your visual interest with the paint job done right. The incorrect use of blue, we've talked about. Too little contrast between the body and the trim colors. Failure to paint the sash a nice dark color. And then we've talked about all the problems with blue, so I won't go into those anymore.